Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange and shadowy year of 536A. Year so thoroughly cursed that even medieval peasants who were not exactly strangers to misery looked around and said, yeah, something's definitely wrong, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene. It's the early 6th century. You're a merchant, a monk, or possibly just someone hoping your turnip harvest doesn't fail again. Life isn't exactly glamorous, but it's predictable. The seasons come and go, the sun rises, does its job, and you complain about it like usual. Then 536 hits, and suddenly, the sun doesn't. At first, it's subtle, a few gray mornings. A sky that just seems a bit off. People squint. Farmers mumble, someone makes a joke about the gods oversleeping. But the clouds don't clear. The light stays dim. Days pass, weeks, the sun continues. It's half-hearted routine, like it's doing the bare minimum. To not get fired across Europe and Asia, something is clearly wrong, and not in the rain ruined my toga kind of way. The Byzantine historian Procopius, not known for dramatics, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness. That's historians speak for. This is deeply unsettling, and we are all going to die. Other chroniclers describe a dry fog that blanketed the world. Not smoke, not mist, just a weird lingering grayness that refused to go away. It didn't blow off with the wind, it didn't rain. It just hovered there, like the planet itself was trying to send a vague atmospheric warning, and no one was picking up. The result, a year that didn't behave. Crops failed to ripen, trees stopped growing, birds migrated in circles, and humans, being humans, tried to explain it. Some said it was divine punishment, others blamed sorcery, eclipses, or the sins of their neighbors. One guy probably blamed it on a goat. History never wrote his name down, but you know he was there. Meanwhile, the average person, the villager, the farmer, the overworked scribe, just had to live through it. No sun meant colder weather, less food, more confusion, and absolutely no idea how long this cosmic prank was going to last. 536 didn't start with a bang, it started with silence. A weird sky, a creeping sense of dread, and the unmistakable feeling that something was broken. And spoiler, it was just getting started, so the sun is up technically, but it's not really participating. It's 536, and across the world people are looking at the sky like it owes them an explanation. What once was a reliable, bright, mildly judgmental sun has now been replaced with a pale loafered disk that looks like it's calling in sick. You'd get more warmth and enthusiasm from a dying candle. Eyewitnesses from Constantinople, China, Mesopotamia, and Ireland all noted the same unsettling thing. Daylight was barely distinguishable from twilight. You'd wake up and assume it was dawn at noon. You'd assume you'd gone blind at sunset. Well, good luck figuring out when that was. The sun no longer set, so much as wandered off quietly mid-conversation. Contemporary writers describe the sun as bluish and without shadow. Now, if you're wondering what kind of sun casts no shadows, congratulations, you're asking the same question every terrified 6th century human was asking right before they prayed into their stew bowl. In China, they reported that stars were visible during the day. Let that sink in. You're tending your rice fields, look up and see constellations. That's not weather. That's the sky soft resetting, and it wasn't just dim, it was also cold. With sunlight filtered out by something mysterious and inconvenient, temperatures dropped, not in a pleasant hot cocoa kind of way, more in the your spring crops think it's January, and your toes have stopped cooperating kind of way. It's worth noting that the people of 536 had no concept of atmospheric science. They had no clue what a volcano was doing thousands of miles away. All they knew was that the sun had stopped doing its job, and when your crop's warmth and general will to live rely on that job, it becomes a bit of a crisis. Naturally, people looked for explanations. The religious saw divine punishment, the astrologers blamed ominous planetary alignments, local leaders probably blamed foreigners, bad omens, and that one guy in the village who always seemed a bit off. Whatever the explanation, one thing was clear: the sun had stopped trying, and when the main character of the sky calls it quits, you know things are about to get dramatically worse. At some point in 536, people started realizing it wasn't just the sun being moody. The entire atmosphere had decided to act weird across continents. Reports came in of a strange phenomenon. A lingering dry fog that didn't behave like any normal weather. It wasn't mist. Mist clears, it wasn't smoke. Smoke smells like something's on fire. This fog just was like a vague, damp ghost, following everyone around, ruining visibility and morale in equal measure. Procopius, the ever-grim Byzantine historian, described the sun as emitting light without brightness and claimed this ghost fog hung over the world for a whole year. That's 12 months of not seeing the sky. Properly not knowing what time it is, not knowing what season it is, and wondering whether this is just what life looks like now in the East. Chinese sources noted yellow dust falling from the sky, and in an extra dash of surrealism, summer snow. Imagine waking up in July to find your crops frosted over, and your chickens very, very confused Irelands. Annals speak of a failure of bread, which is poetic code for mass starvation, and also deeply Irish. You know things are grim when the bread is the first to abandon. You all right? Tonight we begin by stepping into the bleak and bizarre world of the year 536, a time so cursed, so fundamentally off-kilter, that even the most misery-hardened medieval serfsfolk, who typically didn't expect much from life anyway, looked up from their gruel and muttered, "Yeah, ... something's seriously not right." But before we settle into this tale of cosmic confusion and historical gloom, take a second to tap that like button and subscribe only if you actually enjoy this kind of thing, of course. And in the comments, let me know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. There's something deeply soothing about knowing who else is staying up with us across distant corners of the globe. Now, go ahead and dim those lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle humming noise in the background, and let's slowly drift into tonight's descent through one of the most mystifying years history has ever recorded. Picture it now, the early 6th century. You might be a wandering trader, a weary monk, or just some poor soul praying your root vegetables don't rot before winter. Life's not glamorous, but it's familiar. The seasons cycle through, the sun behaves as expected, and you complain about the weather the way you always have. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, comes the year 536 and the sun decides it's had enough. At first, it's minor, just a few mornings where the sky seems oddly gray, a lingering dullness you can't quite place. Villagers squint at the heavens. Farmers mumble under their breath, and someone inevitably cracks a joke about the gods sleeping in. But the clouds don't lift. The strange murkiness stays, as if the light itself has lost interest. Days roll into weeks, and the sun continues showing up late and doing the bare minimum. Like it's trying not to get fired, but doesn't care much either. All across Europe and Asia, it becomes painfully clear that something is off, and not in the "my sandals got wet again" sort of way. The Byzantine chronicler Procopius, who wasn't exactly prone to exaggeration, remarked that the sun shone, but without its usual brilliance, which, translated from historian speak, basically means, "This is terrifying, and we might all be doomed." Other accounts mention a strange, parched haze blanketing the earth. Not quite smoke, not quite fog, just a dry, persistent gloom that wouldn't shift. It didn't get blown away by gusts of wind. It didn't wash out with rain. It just clung to everything, like the sky had developed a passive-aggressive grudge against humanity, and was communicating it through thick, emotionless atmosphere. The world entered a season that refused to behave. Crops halted before ripening. Trees simply stopped bothering to grow. Birds circled aimlessly, seemingly as confused as the humans watching them. And of course, being human, people started reaching for answers. Some whispered about divine wrath. Others feared witchcraft, sinister omens, or that maybe the stars were lining up in a way that spelled trouble. Someone probably pointed fingers at his neighbor's goat. History didn't preserve his name, but we all know he existed. Meanwhile, the regular folks, the field hands, the shepherds, the temple scribes with ink-stained robes, had no choice but to endure. A sunless sky meant lower temperatures, diminished food supplies, increased panic, and a deepening sense of uncertainty, as no one could say when or if the light would return. The year 536 didn't begin with an explosion. It crept in like a quiet horror, a low-hanging silence in the air, a broken pattern everyone could feel but no one could explain. And, just so you know, was far from over. Officially, yes, the sun was still present in the sky, technically, but calling what showed up sunlight would be a generous stretch. Around the world, eyes turned upward in confusion, silently demanding answers from the dim circle overhead, that once commanded time and temperature, and now looked like it had given up entirely. The dependable, somewhat judgmental sun of old had been replaced by a pale, half-hearted disk that resembled a candle on its last flicker, more mournful glow than light source. Observers from places as far apart as Constantinople, the Chinese Empire, Mesopotamia, and ancient Ireland all reported a similar unnerving reality. Daylight had become almost indistinguishable from dusk. You'd rise thinking it was early morning, glance around at noon and wonder if your eyesight had failed, and then stumble through what may or may not have been evening. Sunset didn't so much occur as evaporate. The sun no longer set like it. Used to it simply meandered out of view, like someone sneaking out of a dull conversation. Writers of the time described it as a blue-tinged glow, with no defined shadow. If you're asking yourself how a sun can shine and cast no shadows, well, congratulations. You're having the same existential crisis that every 6th century observer experienced while stirring their congealed soup and whispering to the heavens. In China, people claimed to see stars during the day. Wrap your head around that you're bent over in your rice paddy, glance upward, and spot constellations meant for midnight. That's not just strange weather. That's the sky pushing the reset button. And it wasn't just dim, it was bitter. With the sunlight blocked or distorted by some unknown force, temperatures dropped significantly. Not in a cozy grab your shawl kind of way, more like a grim realization that your spring crops now think it's February, and your fingers have gone numb. Keep in mind, these people had zero understanding of atmospheric science. They had no clue that a volcanic eruption on the other side of the world could wreak havoc in their own village. They just knew something had gone terribly wrong, and their very survival hinged on the sun doing its job. So naturally, they scrambled for explanations. The pious saw it as punishment from on high. The astrologers cited troublesome planetary alignments. Local rulers likely blamed the foreign tribes, old prophecies, and that slightly odd fellow who always muttered to himself. Regardless of the theories, one truth became unavoidable. The sun had stopped trying. And when the main celestial character of your daily life just gives up, you can bet things are heading into darker territory. Somewhere in the middle of that awful year, people began to realize it wasn't just the sun acting strangely. The very air around them had turned uncooperative. Reports from different regions spoke of a peculiar condition, eerie, dry mist that didn't obey the usual rules of weather. This wasn't fog. Fog lifts. It wasn't smoke. Either smoke smells like burning and signals something specific. This was a phantom haze, a spectral blanket that clung to the world and refused to move, reducing visibility and morale in equal measure. The ever-serious Procopius described it as a year-long shroud, during which the sun produced light without brightness. Imagine that 12 straight months of not being able to tell what time it is, or what season you're in, or whether this is just how life's going to be now. In the east, Chinese sources recorded yellow dust falling from the sky. Add to that a strange detail of snow falling in summer. Yes, you wake up in the middle of July, expecting warmth. And instead, your crops are covered in frost, and your livestock are looking at you like the world has gone mad. Over in Ireland, historical records mentioned the failure of bread, a poetic, yet haunting phrase that translates to widespread hunger and crop disaster. And in true Irish fashion, it's a quiet understatement, masking a full-blown catastrophe. You know things are truly dire when even the bread gives up. So by now, you're probably thinking that things in 536 couldn't possibly get worsened. That's where you'd be mistaken. Because if a sun that barely shows up, an atmosphere that feels like ghost soup, and weather that makes no sense, weren't enough to send civilizations into a quiet panic, well, the Earth decided to toss in some volcanic flare, just to keep things interesting. See, while no one at the time could have understood the true cause. Modern science has managed to trace the global dimming and bizarre climate drop back to a massive volcanic eruption, or possibly multiple eruptions that threw untold quantities of ash, sulfur, and particulates into the upper atmosphere. The exact location is still debated, with candidates ranging from Iceland to Central America to Indonesia. But what matters most is what that eruption did. It blotted out the sun on a planetary scale. The microscopic volcanic particles formed a kind of sun-blocking veil in the stratosphere, which lingered like a moody curtain no one could pull back. And for people of the 6th century, who had no concept of atmospheric dust, jet streams, or volcanic aerosols, felt like the heavens had simply given up on them. The earth had hiccuped, and the response was a kind of slow, cold suffocation. Crops failed, livestock starved, humans followed. Food reserves were already minimal for most subsistence-level communities. So when harvests didn't come in, there was nothing to fall back on. This wasn't a bad season. This was several bad seasons back-to-back, each one worse than the last. Across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East, records began to reflect not just the confusion, but the desperation. And when people get desperate, societies begin to unravel. In the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium, cities, already burdened with plague, political tension, and border raids found their stress levels snapping. Procopius, who'd already sounded alarm bells about the dim sun, would go on to chronicle the chaos that followed famine, riots, and a breakdown in the systems that had, however loosely, held things together. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty struggled with food shortages and uprisings. The imperial court recorded instances of yellow fog and failing harvests. In Ireland, annals noted failed grain and empty fields. In the Andes, tree rings show that growth was stunted for years. And in parts of the Middle East, Arabic chroniclers described unusual cold and sky phenomena. It wasn't just that things were going wrong, it was that things were going wrong everywhere, all at once. Even in regions far from the epicenter of the eruption, the consequences reached like cold, ghostly fingers. Monsoon patterns shifted. Rain failed to arrive where it should. Frost appeared in the wrong months. Crops rotted in the soil, or never matured to begin with. In today's world, we might think of natural disasters as local events. But in the 6th century, when everyone relied on the weather for survival, a planetary-scale climate disruption meant that famine wasn't an isolated tragedy, was universal. And what made it worse was that no one had any idea what was causing it. There were no satellites, no global weather models, no emergency broadcasts. All they had were rumors, omens, and vague terror. People turned to gods, spirits, anything that might offer an answer, or at least a scapegoat. Priests held ceremonies. Oracles gave cryptic advice. Accusations of witchcraft spiked. And yes, somewhere out there, another goat was probably blamed. But the reality was cruelly indifferent to explanation, because the earth didn't care what people believed, had already made its move. And as the volcanic ash spread across the stratosphere, global temperatures dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. Now, that might not sound like much, but remember, this was a world already teetering on the edge of subsistence. 2 degrees meant the difference between barley ripening or failing, between winter ending and simply continuing under a different name. And when spring never fully arrived, and summer felt more like early autumn, you didn't just lose food, you lost hope. By the time the first year of strange twilight faded into the second, famine had dug its claws in deep. In some places, entire villages were abandoned. People wandered the countryside in search of anything edible, roots, leaves, even the bark off trees. In cities, the markets went silent. Coin lost its value because you couldn't eat it. Stories began to spread of cannibalism, of mass graves, of mothers leaving children behind to save the others. These were not exaggerations. These were memories etched into oral tradition and written chronicles, passed down by those who managed to live through the worst. In Constantinople, grain prices soared. Bread became a luxury. Elsewhere, it disappeared altogether. And yet perhaps, most hauntingly, much of this suffering was endured in silence. Because what can you do when the sun stops shining and you don't know why? You wait, you pray, you suffer. And if you're lucky, you survive long enough to tell someone what happened. What makes the year 536 so remarkable isn't just that the skies went dark, or the weather turned against its people. It's that it triggered a cascade of aftershocks that would shape the century that followed. This was the opening note in a symphony of disaster. The climate didn't bounce back immediately. The volcanic debris lingered in the upper atmosphere for years, and just when things seemed like they might start improving, nature had one more cruel surprise waiting. But we'll get to that. For now, let's pause in this moment. The year is still 536. The sky above is the color of wet stone. The sun, when it dares to appear, is a pale, unhelpful ghost. Fields lie barren. Rivers run cold. The wind has a bite, even in summer. You're huddled in a home built of mud and timber, trying to keep your family warm, trying to explain to your children why their bellies ache and their world looks broken. You don't know that a volcano erupted. You don't know that other people in far-off lands are feeling the same fear. You only know that something enormous has shifted on, that life before now feels like a dream you've woken up from too soon. And yet, as terrifying as this all sounds, it was only the beginning of what historians would come to call the late antique Little Ice Age, a period where climate chaos, famine, and plague worked hand in hand to reshape the ancient world. The gears of history had begun grinding in a new direction, and there was no stopping it. The year 536 wasn't just a bad year. It was the first step down a path no one saw coming. So, we've made it through the eerie twilight of 536. A year that felt more like a slow-motion apocalypse than a calendar date. You might be hoping now for a shift toward recovery, a bit of warmth returning to the world, maybe a hopeful harvest, or a sun that finally remembers how to shine. But history, unfortunately, had other ideas, because just as humanity was starting to adjust to the dim skies, weird seasons, and ghost fog ambience, something even worse was waiting in the wings. You see, if 536 was the year the lights dimmed, then 541 was the year the body count began. That's when the so-called plague of Justinian hit, an outbreak so ferocious, so unrelenting, that it became the first officially recorded instance of bubonic plague in human history. Now remember, these are people already ground down by years of bad harvests, cold summers, and the psychological weight of the sun's betrayal. They were already thin, weak, malnourished. Their immune systems weren't up for a fight. So when Yersinia pesticide behind the Black Death decided to show up a few centuries early, it didn't just kill. It tore through cities, like a storm through dry fields. Constantinople was the epicenter, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and it didn't stand a chance. Ships docked in its harbors, unloading goods from Egypt and beyond, and along with the grain and spices came fleas, and rats, and death. The records are vivid and grim, people developing sudden fevers, swellings under the arms or groin, black blotches on their skin. Within days, many were dead. Entire households perished before help could even arrive. The Emperor Justinian himself caught it, and, somehow, survived, though his grip on the empire never fully recovered. Estimates vary wildly, but some say as many as half the population of Constantinople was wiped out. Half 1 in 2. Imagine walking down a street where every second home is silent, windows shuttered, doors unopened, no sound but the flies. Now, unlike the later plague pandemics that would sweep Europe in the Middle Ages, the people of the 6th century had no idea what they were up against. They had no microscopes, no germ theory, no concept of contagion. All they knew was that death came fast, it came without warning, and it spared no one, noble or peasant, child or elder. And unlike a failed harvest, which might be localized, or a darkened sky that at least allowed for hope, the plague came like a scythe across the throat of civilization. It spread out from Constantinople into the Mediterranean basin, riding with traders, hitching rides with soldiers, slipping through market stalls and back alleys. Egypt, Syria, Italy, Gaul. The disease didn't discriminate. Where people gathered, it followed. Cities emptied. Fields were left untended. Armies broke apart. Governments faltered. Grain shipments stopped. Taxes couldn't be collected because tax collectors were dying or already dead. One bishop wrote that the dead were so numerous there weren't enough people left alive to bury them. Corpses piled up in houses, in temples, even in aqueducts, where they were dumped when the city ran out of space. And remember, All of this happened just a few years after 536 had made the world cold, confused, and starving. So if you're trying to imagine what it was like to live through this period, try picturing this. You've already endured several winters that felt more like hunger season than snow season. The sun barely works, the crops fail regularly, your neighbors are gone, and now, out of nowhere, a sickness begins killing people faster than you can say goodbye, and not just quietly, either. It was messy, loud, terrifying, the body bloated, blackened, and oozed. The mind, already stressed by years of hardship, snapped under the strain. People stopped gathering in markets. They stopped helping each other. The priests who once offered comfort were dying too. There were no answers, only rituals and guesses. Was it punishment? Sorcery? Were the gods angry because the temples had grown silent? Some blamed foreigners, others blamed heretics. But the truth is, it didn't matter who you blamed, because the plague was faster than rumors, and more thorough than fear. Even trade began to collapse. The ancient world's economic arteries, those sea routes and caravans that moved silk, grain, and gold, began to seize up. Ships were turned away, ports were abandoned. Cities that had stood as strongholds for centuries lost so many people that they essentially ceased to function. The empire itself, ruled by Justinian from the heart of Byzantium, began to fray. He had dreams of restoring Rome's old glories, reclaiming territory, building monuments, uniting East and West, but the plague ripped the foundation out from under those ambitions. His wars stalled, his revenues dried up, and the mood of the population darkened further still. Some began to wonder if they were living through the end of the world, and honestly, from their perspective, it would have made perfect sense. The climate had turned against them. The sun had withdrawn its favor. The soil gave less and less. And now the bodies were piling up in the streets, not from war or rebellion, but from an invisible force that no one could see, let alone stop. So what was life like for the average person in 541? You woke up and checked if your family was still breathing. You ate what little you had, if anything. You avoided the city, the market, the crowds. You prayed more often, but with less certainty. You watched as animals roamed untended fields, and temples filled with silence instead of song. You smelled decay. You heard weeping. You buried your dead in the shallowest ground you could manage. And you never knew if you'd live through the week. In the West, things weren't any better. The already crumbling remains of the Western Roman Empire saw further breakdown. In Gaul, in Hispania, in North Africa, wherever communities had started to rebuild, the plague hollowed them out again. Trade slowed to a crawl. Communications between cities collapsed. Knowledge that once moved between scholars now stopped. At the edge of a village. It's in this chaos that we begin to see the formation of the world we'd come to call the early Middle Ages, a time often unfairly labeled as dark. But in this case, that label feels earned. Because it wasn't just about the absence of light, it was about the absence of certainty, of structure, of understanding. And all of it had been set in motion by a sun that went dim, a volcano that whispered chaos into the sky, and a bacterium that rode in quietly on a flea. This was not a single event, it was a chain reaction. The volcanic winter of 536 weakened. The population, the failing crops and unseasonal cold left people vulnerable. Then the plague struck, not as a separate crisis, but as the next grim chapter in an already unfolding catastrophe. And if you're wondering when the misery ends, well, it doesn't. Not quickly, not neatly. This was a turning point. The 6th century didn't just endure a crisis. It changed direction entirely. The ancient world, with its columns and scrolls, and grand empires, gave way to something else, something slower, more local, more fragile. But before that new world could even begin to emerge, the old one had to finish falling apart. And in the next chapter of our story, we'll follow that descent further into madness, migration, and the long, cold silence that followed. So here we are, the mid-6th century, where humanity isn't just struggling to survive anymore. It's clutching at the very edge of its known world, watching the old structures collapse like tired scaffolding in a windstorm. The sun has dimmed. The food has withered, and now a plague quiet and invisible has swept through the arteries of civilization. But just when you think the worst might be over, history, with its signature cruelty, begins to press down harder. Because now we enter the phase of long-term unraveling. This wasn't a quick crisis. This was a deep, dragging rot that rewrote the tempo of human life. Imagine being a child born in 542. You've never known a normal sky, never tasted a full harvest, never walked through a city that wasn't half empty or half silent. Your first memories are of your parents whispering about spirits, of cold wind sneaking through cracks in the wall, of strangers being buried in the middle of the road. You're growing up in the ruins of a world that used to be organized, and you're expected to make sense of it. The consequences of these years didn't just remain trapped in that generation. They rippled outward, folding themselves into the very foundation of what came next. The Roman Empire, though still technically functioning in the East, was now a ghost of its former self. The grand ambitions of Emperor Justinian had been sliced into ribbons by famine, pestilence, and dwindling manpower. His dream of a reunited Roman world, one empire stretching from Constantinople to the Atlantic, was buried under corpses, unpaid soldiers, and abandoned farms. And it wasn't just politics or armies that suffered it. It was knowledge itself. Libraries fell into disuse. Scholars died. Books decayed in forgotten corners. Whole schools of thought simply vanished. Art, architecture, theology, everything slowed down. In the West, the vacuum left by Rome's final gasp was filled not by glorious new kingdoms, but by fragmentary, tribal rules, smaller polities that had no resources to build great cities or fund philosophers. Infrastructure collapsed. Roads, once patrolled and maintained, now became overgrown tracks prone to banditry and rot. Trade routes narrowed or disappeared entirely. Markets thinned out. Coinage became rare. A barter economy crept back in. To live in the post-536 world was to live locally and anxiously. And here's something to sit with. This wasn't just a brief detour in human progress that lasted for decades. The climate didn't correct itself in a year or two. Data and ice core samples tell us the cooling lingered. The atmosphere remained volatile. The late antique Little Ice Age stretched from around 536 to well into the 7th century, with repeated volcanic activity and inconsistent sun patterns continuing to torment already weakened populations. And even when the sky started clearing, the world it revealed was not the same one that had entered the storm. In Northern Europe, societies that once relied on Roman influence were now carving out isolated existences in the forests and hills. Kings ruled from wooden halls instead of marble palaces. In the Mediterranean, trade ports that had buzzed with activity were silent. Grain fleets from Egypt stopped coming. North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, began to starve. In Britain, the post-Roman era gave way to chaos. Without Roman legions to defend the coasts, raids increased. Literacy plummeted. The language of law and learning eroded. Historians argue over exactly how dark the Dark Ages were. But there's no denying that something massive had changed. It wasn't coming back soon. Religion, of course, filled the vacuum. When governments failed and crops didn't grow, people turned upward. Not just to the sun they barely saw, but to heavens beyond it. In both the Christian and Islamic worlds, though Islam wouldn't emerge. For another few decades, apocalyptic thought began to take root. The end was near. God was angry. This world was being punished, and only repentance or separation from the sinful could offer safety. Monasteries became the new centers of learning and preservation. Away from the plague-ridden cities and starving farmlands, monks began copying texts by hand, quietly preserving the intellectual DNA of civilizations teetering on the brink. In the East, Byzantine theologians debated why the sky had turned gray. In the West, Christian leaders used the catastrophe as proof of divine justice. And in places where pagan traditions still lingered, old gods were either blamed or called upon in desperation. The gods, like the sun, remained silent. But silence didn't stop the rumors. Word of mouth became the only news network, and it thrived in uncertainty. Tales of distant lands, untouched by the plague. Whispers of saints who healed the sick. Murmurs of omens in the sky, or animals behaving strangely. Every eclipse was a warning. Every shooting star became a prophecy. In the absence of reliable knowledge, mystery took the throne. And yet, amid all this, life still tried to continue. Children were still born. Fields were still planted. People still laughed, married, built fires, and dreamed. There's something brutally beautiful in that. Humanity didn't vanish. It bent, yes. It broke in places. But it didn't vanish. Even in the most fractured towns, someone kept track of seasons. Someone passed on stories. Someone taught a child how to till soil, how to bind wounds, how to tell time by what little light there was. In this way, the world didn't end it. Just dimmed. It grew quieter, slower, more fragile, but still alive. And this fragility is what defined the coming centuries. The empires that rose again in later years were built on bones, both literal and symbolic. The Carolingians, the Abbasids, the Tang dynasty, all of them emerged in a world still recovering from the century that nearly shattered everything. But in 540, 550, even as late as 560, those revivals were just flickers on the horizon. The people alive then weren't building toward a new golden age. They were surviving. That's it. Holding on to whatever they could, whether it was grain, faith, warmth, or memory. The sky still bore scars. The earth was still cold in places it shouldn't have been. And the question on everyone's mind, though few dared say it aloud, was simple. Is this just how the world is now? Has the sun gone for good? Is this the beginning of something permanent? Or will the warmth return someday, when we've suffered enough? No one knew. And that not knowing that was its own kind of terror. Not a terror like fire or battle, but a dull ache in the back of the skull, a constant awareness that the rules had changed, and no one knew how to read the new ones. If there's one thing the mid-6th century teaches us, it's that collapse isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a soft, unending twilight, a chill in the air, a silence where there used to be song. And in that silence, the world waited for light, for healing, for meaning. But history, as always, had more in store. As the world stumbled through the fog of the mid-6th century, bruised by cold skies, famine, and plague, it wasn't only the natural world that felt broken. Human memory itself seemed to falter. Entire generations were now growing up in the aftermath of chaos, with no frame of reference for how life used to be. And that silence, that slow forgetting, may have been the most lasting consequence of all. Because when empires fall, and cities empty, and roads vanish into weeds, it isn't just brick and mortar that gets swallowed up. It's the stories, too. The chain of knowledge linking father to son, teacher to student, scribe to apprentice, that chain phrase. And then, little by little, things once known become mystery. The people alive in the decades after 536 weren't just dealing with disrupted climate and shattered governments, they were grappling with the weight of a vanished past. Picture yourself in a small village somewhere in what was once Gaul, or Anatolia, or North Africa. Maybe you're sitting beside a weak fire, listening to your grandfather talk about how, in his youth, ships used to come into the harbor twice a week, or how festivals lit up the city square, or how the sun once rose, bright enough to blind you if you stared too long. To you, these are fairy tales. Your world is one of quiet mornings, of meals you can count on one hand per week, of sky the color of steel. You've never seen a city square. You've never seen a clear sunrise. You only know what used to be because someone keeps saying it out loud. But each time they say it, it sounds a little more distant, a little more like myth. This is what it means to live in the long shadow of disaster. When the trauma outlasts the event itself, when survival becomes the main tradition passed down, and it's during this time when the old is gone, and the new hasn't arrived yet, that strange ideas begin to take root, across Europe, across Asia, across every place touched by the sun's long sulk and the plague's cruel sweep. People started turning not just to religion, but to deeper, darker corners of belief. Superstition wasn't a side effect, became the default. You might laugh today at the idea that a goat's shadow could curse a harvest, or that stars rearranged themselves to signal a village's doom. But back then, with the sun acting like a guilty ghost and the rivers flooding out of season, you'd believe it too. People needed explanations. any explanations. Because a world without reasons is unbearable. And so folklore filled the gaps. Local spirits, angry ancestors, omens and cloud formations, whispers in the wind. These weren't quaint traditions. These were survival tools, ways to make sense of a world that no longer obeyed rules. The line between faith and fear blurred. A lightning strike wasn't just a storm, it was divine wrath. A crop that withered in a single night wasn't just frost, it was punishment. And if you could find a reason, maybe, just maybe, you could stop it from happening again. This era gave rise to the deep embedding of apocalyptic thinking. In Christian Europe, sermons became more intense, more urgent. The book of Revelation was no longer a distant vision, it felt like a weather report. The four horsemen weren't symbols, they were neighbors. In the East, Buddhist monks began preaching of cycles, of worlds destroyed and reborn, trying to soothe terrified farmers whose rice fields had drowned under freezing summer rain. In Arabia, the silence of forgotten trade routes was broken by new movements, new ideas born in the vacuum left behind. And in the north, among Norse tribes, sagas began to speak of Ragnarok not as an end far in the future, but as something already stirring. Death was everywhere. And where there is death, people seek prophecy. But amid all the confusion, one thing remained constant: adaptation. Human beings, for all their fragility, are astonishingly good at bending. When the Roman aqueducts dried up, people dug wells. When the old gods stopped answering, they carved new idols. When the roads vanished into forest, they made paths from memory. The world didn't rebuild quickly, but it didn't stop, either. That's the paradox of collapse. It destroys institutions, cities, comfort, but it doesn't erase the will to continue. Somewhere in the Alps, a farmer figured out how to plant later in the season. Somewhere in Syria, a widow taught her children how to dry and store roots for the next famine. Somewhere in Ireland, a monk kept copying manuscripts by candlelight, even though the wind kept blowing through the cracks in the wall. And slowly, painfully, slowly a new rhythm began to emerge. Not the old one, not the Roman one. Something quieter, something more humble. A calendar based on what little nature still offered. Rituals built around harvests that might or might not come. Communities shrinking inward, relying only on those they could see, trust, or bury themselves. But make no mistake, this wasn't a peaceful reset. It was more like a long, deep breath taken underwater. People were waiting for the sky to change, for warmth to return, for death to loosen its grip. And as they waited, their memories of the great cities, of the old ways, of the mighty emperors and marble forums and global trade, those memories began to fade like the stars, once visible in daylight during the long darkness. What replaced them was something different. Simpler, yes, but also heavier. Because when you've seen the sky go dim for a year, and buried your neighbors, and watched the grain rot in the fields, you don't forget. You carry it in your bones. And that inheritance shaped the medieval world to come. The monks who wrote illuminated gospels in cold stone abbeys, they were descendants of plague survivors. The kings who ruled fragmented kingdoms with tight fists, they were grandchildren of starving peasants. Even the architecture changed. Churches became thicker, darker, fortress-like. Art grew more somber. Music lost its playful edges. And the stories, those bedtime tales and village legends, they were filled with monsters, with warnings, with gods who never smiled. Because in a world where the sun once left without explanation, you never quite trusted again. And so, by the end of the 6th century, something new had taken shape. Not the rebirth of what was lost, but the skeleton of what would eventually rise. A medieval world forged not by peace, but by persistence. A world haunted by what it had survived, and yet still, somehow, unbelievably looking toward tomorrow. Because no matter how dim the sky had been, dawn still came. Maybe not brightly, maybe not warmly, but it came. And for those still alive to witness it, that alone was enough reason to keep going, even as they forgot the names of emperors, and the routes of ships, and the sounds of markets that once buzzed with life. Even as all that slipped away, they remembered how to wake up, how to try again, how to survive. And that memory, that instinct would prove stronger than any darkness. Now picture yourself again, but this time not as a child sitting beside your grandfather's fire, listening to stories of golden cities and sunlit fields long vanished. Now you are the grandfather. The fire crackles low. Your bones ache in the cold, not because of age alone, but because there are no trees left to spare for warmth. You speak in half-hushed tones, not out of fear, but out of habit learned, in a world where silence was safer than questions. Around you are children who know nothing of empires, nothing of trade or law or libraries. They have never touched parchment. They don't know that aqueducts once sang with water, or that people used to laugh in open forums while debating the nature of justice. All they know is that the earth is stingy and the sky doesn't shine like it used to, and you, hunched and wheezing, are the last living bookmark of an erased chapter. This was the late 6th century. Civilization had not ended, but it had shed layers like an old tree, peeling off bark, hoping that something tougher might grow. Beneath the centers of knowledge and power, once vast and gleaming, had dimmed. Many were gone altogether. Others were mere shadows of their past, holding on with trembling hands to whatever fragments could be salvaged. The city of Rome still stood, yes, but barely. The baths were dry. The fountains had stopped whispering. Streets were no longer swept by proud citizens in togas, but stalked by wolves, weeds, and wind. The Senate, if you could call it, that no longer issued decrees that stretched across the known world. Instead, small councils governed what little land hadn't yet been swallowed by chaos. And who ruled those fragments? Not philosophers, not builders, but warlords, bandits, religious zealots, anyone with a sword and a following. In Constantinople, things were a little brighter, but only just. The Eastern Roman Empire, often called Byzantium by historians, had managed to hold on through the worst of it, though not without bruises. Emperor Justinian, once hailed as a second Caesar, had tried to reassemble the shattered pieces of Roman glory. He had dreams, grand ones, rebuilding roads, reclaiming lost provinces, codifying law into something pure and eternal. And for a moment, it seemed like it might work. But then came the plague, that invisible monster, riding the fleas of rats, spreading through ships and streets in breath. It hit Constantinople like a curse spoken to clearly. Within months, tens of thousands lay dead. The emperor himself fell ill, barely surviving, and when he rose from his sickbed, the empire he'd dreamt of rekindling was weaker, colder, more fragile. The coffers were empty, armies had withered, cities had locked their gates. Justinian's vision faded, not because it was flawed, but because the world simply wasn't listening anymore. The age of ambition had ended. This was the age of endurance. Across the Mediterranean, once busy ports now echoed only with the gulls' cries. The grain fleets that had once fed empires no longer came. In Egypt, farmers cursed the Nile for its erratic moods. Some years, it barely rose. Other times, it drowned the fields. People whispered that the river itself was mourning. In Britain, abandoned Roman villas crumbled as ivy crawled over their mosaics. Saxon invaders didn't preserve the past, they built over it, or ignored it, or forgot it. The stones remembered, but no one asked them to speak. And yet, amid all this decay, something else was stirring, not loudly, not proudly, but persistently. In monasteries, clinging to hillsides. In village churches, where priests stumbled through Latin they barely understood. In the hands of monks who copied old texts line by line, even when they couldn't grasp the meaning. These places became the new centers of continuity. Not innovation those days were gone, but preservation. You might think of these monks as scholars, but they were more like gardeners. They didn't plant new ideas. They simply tried to stop the old ones from dying. In a time where ignorance was safer than knowledge, where questioning the sky might earn you exile, or worse, these monks dared to remember. They remembered Aristotle. They remembered Cicero. They remembered Galen and Ptolemy and Augustine. Not because they hoped to revive their world, but because they couldn't bear to let it disappear. And that fragile thread, that thread of memory would, centuries later, help to weave something new. But for now, it was all about surviving the silence, and the silence was everywhere. In art, colors grew dimmer. The frescoes were still painted, but the faces looked tired, the halos dull. In music, tones grew slower, more solemn chants rising like prayers whispered through frost. In stories, the monsters became crueler, the heroes more tragic, the morals darker. Hope didn't vanish, just hid behind cloaks of humility. This was not a world that celebrated itself. It was a world that apologized for surviving. And yet survive. It did. People fell in love. They built small homes. They raised goats and tried to teach their children how to predict the seasons. Even when the seasons ignored their predictions. Some still sang. Others still carved little patterns into their walls, hoping that beauty might protect them. A few even laughed, quietly, cautiously. Not because the world was good, but because laughter was the last rebellion they had. Imagine a young woman in the Alps, digging roots through half-frozen soil. She hums something her mother taught her, a lullaby, about sun and spring. She's never known either, not really. But the song remains. And that song is a kind of resistance. It's a vow that someday, someone will see the sun again. That's what this forgotten century became, a long hallway between catastrophe and recovery. Most don't talk about it, because it has no flashy wars, no stunning victories, no crowned heroes. But that's exactly what makes it so human. It's the century of small hands doing small things with quiet courage. The century of people holding candles in the dark, not to chase the darkness away, but just to keep themselves company. The 6th century didn't build much, but it didn't give up either. And sometimes, that's more impressive. Because when the sky turns gray for years, when plague steals every third face, you know? When governments crumble and roads disappear and every book seems to rot, continuing becomes a sacred act. Continuing is the legacy. That's what this chapter in history teaches, not how to conquer, but how to endure. Not how to thrive, but how to remember enough to rebuild. And somewhere, deep in the marrow of your bones, you carry that same instinct. You, too, are a descendant of those who refused to stop. Whether they were farmers, or monks, or barefoot children in ash-covered streets, they passed something on. Something that doesn't glow or shout or glitter. Something that doesn't show up on timelines or monuments. But something real. The will to keep going. Even when the sun forgets to rise. So now we follow the footsteps of those who walked through the smudged and smoky aftermath of history's long collapse, people who didn't call it collapse. Of course, because you never know you're in the ruins until someone later names it. So, they just called it life. Their reality wasn't a chapter in a textbook or a marker between empires. It was the only world they had, broken, brittle, often bitter, but still theirs. And while kings and emperors faded from memory, it was the quieter figures, the ones history often skips, who held the line. Imagine a village somewhere in Gaul. The Romans had pulled out long ago, their banners and legions now only myths. The roads they built had crumbled, not entirely, but enough to let weeds speak more loudly than wheels. In that village, there is no governor, no imperial tax collector. There is just an elder with a bad hip and an old staff, who remembers how to count and how to settle disputes with a tone of voice, more than with laws. He is the law now, not because anyone voted for him, but because he's still here. Nearby, a woman brews tinctures from herbs she gathered at dawn. She knows which bark eases fever, which root calms coughing, and how to whisper comfort to the dying. They call her a healer, or sometimes a witch, depending on the mood. She doesn't care what they call her. She just does what needs doing. Across the hills, a stone church stands half sunk into the mud, its roof patched with thatch, and Hope, a priest barely literate, but earnest reads from a book he does not fully understand. The Latin spills from his mouth like a rain-ruined prayer, half-remembered, but still offered. His congregation stares not at the words, but at the way. His hands tremble. That's what matters. The trembling, the fact that he's still trying, because trying had become the sacred act of this age. Great architecture had stopped. Grand conquests had ended. Even art, for the most part, had retreated into smallness. But stubbornness had become the foundation of survival. You see it in the way people clung to tradition, not out of nostalgia, but because it gave them something to grip in a world that kept shifting. You see it in the scribes, bent-backed and candleblind, copying texts they couldn't decipher, just so the letters wouldn't vanish. You see it in the farmers who planted despite the cold, despite the ash, despite the famines, whispering ancient planting rhymes to soil that had forgotten how to listen. Even war had changed. Gone were the disciplined ranks of Roman legions. Battles now were small, messy, often personal. Clans clashed over rivers and grazing rights. Swords were shorter, shields rougher, and victories fleeting. Yet even here, amid blood and bark and betrayal, there was a rhythm, a way of continuing, a strange kind of order emerging from the fog. Not order imposed from above, but grown from below, like moss reclaiming stone. And in some strange way, that moss mattered more than marble ever had. Because empires fall, they always do, but moss endures. Meanwhile, out at sea, the trade routes that once connected continents now bristled with uncertainty. Pirates weren't the cinematic kind with hats and parrots. They were just hungry men in creaking boats, looking to survive one more week. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, had become unpredictable. Merchants whispered prayers before setting sail. Storms had grown moodier. The stars didn't shine as they once did. Or perhaps it was just the memory of starlight that had changed. In the east, the Sassanid Empire, Persia's ancient rival to Rome, faced its own demons. The darkness didn't play favorites. Famine crossed all borders. Plague knocked on every palace. Even gods, it seemed, had fallen quiet. Yet even silence can be fertile, because in that hush, new myths began to grow. Stories traveled farther than armies. Tales of saints who glowed in the dark, of angels who wept over cities, of devils in the woods and miracles in wells. People needed meaning, and where history faltered, myth stepped in. This wasn't just escapism. It was construction. The scaffolding of a future faith, a future worldview, rising from the ashes of a shattered past. And nowhere was this truer than in the shadows of monasteries. There, monks stitched together a world with ink and prayer. In Ireland, which the Romans had never bothered to conquer, Christianity took root like wild clover. Missionaries with wind-burned cheeks and woolen cloaks set off across Europe, not with swords, but with songs. They brought not empire, but memories of old knowledge, old words, old hopes. They became the gardeners of forgotten thought. And as Europe shivered under its endless gray sky, those gardeners planted ideas like seeds beneath snow, not for themselves, but for anyone who might live to see spring. In these long centuries, time stretched strangely. One generation might be born, suffer, and die without seeing a single change. The world moved slowly, if it moved at all. And yet, this slowness was its own kind of miracle. Because while everything big had fallen, cities, armies, economies, something small had survived. Human routine, a cup of broth shared at dusk, a lullaby hummed to a child, a fire tended carefully through the night, the touch of a hand against the cold. These became the new rituals, the real rituals. And maybe, just maybe, that's what mattered most. Because when you strip away the domes and decrees, the sculptures and speeches, you're left with something very plain. The will to go on. The quiet refusal to stop. And in this strange half-century, after 536 AD, that refusal was everywhere. In the cracked bowls repaired with ash and glue. In the letters carved into wooden planks instead of parchment. In the shrines made from bones and twine in desperate hope. This was not a time of triumph. It was a time of tenderness. And tenderness, as it turns out, can be stronger than stone. We call it the Dark Ages, but maybe that says more about us than it does about them. Maybe the darkness wasn't a lack of light, but a thick fog of forgetting, a century where humanity had to feel its way forward without a map. Maybe the people of that time weren't lost. Maybe they were just patient, waiting, whispering, working. And as we turn the page to the next section, remember this: not all greatness looks like gold. Sometimes it looks like soot-stained hands and cracked lips, and a lullaby sung to a child who may never know your name. Sometimes, the greatest story is simply the one where we didn't vanish. Where Despite everything, we were still here. And so, our journey through the year that refused to end this twilight after 536 pulls us deeper into the small, trembling lives that somehow kept breathing through the fog. You might think of them now as ghosts, these people who wandered through ash-blown streets and fields that no longer remembered how to feed them. But they weren't ghosts. They were stubborn, flesh-and-bone survivors. And they had something far more powerful than optimism. They had habits. Even when the skies refused to clear, the sun barely glowed, and the cold air scraped at their throats like broken glass, they still got up each morning and tried again. They didn't need hope to chop wood, mend boots, or bury the dead. They just needed duty. This was the glue of the post-collapse world, not heroism, not vision, but repetition. In the Scandinavian north, where the frost had always been sharp and the earth untrusting, the ancient rhythms of clan and harvest ground onward, slower than before, but not yet stopped. Fishermen cast their nets through freezing slush, pulling in fewer fish, but never none. Elder women scraped lichen from stones to boil into bitter broth. Fathers taught their sons to read animal tracks, though many of those animals had disappeared, and each long night was passed with story-slow, murmuring tales about trolls and fire spirits, about summers that used to come and might one day return. You can imagine one such night now. A low hut, barely warm, the door whistling with wind. A child coughs in the corner, while his mother chews salted roots too hard to swallow. The old man with clouded eyes begins to hum the tale of a god who disappeared into the sea and vowed to return when the world was ready to be whole again. The boy listens, not because he believes it, but because he needs something, anything, to stretch his imagination beyond the hunger in his belly. Stories were not decoration in this world. They were tools. They shaped behavior, softened grief, and filled the blank spaces left by lost knowledge. Meanwhile, deep in the Alps and other mountainous arteries of old Europe, shepherds still moved flocks across ice-dusted valleys. They carried with them a memory of a different time when roads had names and towns had gates. But those memories were growing fuzzy, like the sheep's wool they lived beside. Roman bridges had fallen into rivers. Roman coins were now used as amulets or gaming tokens. Latin was still chanted in monasteries, but was otherwise a dead tongue muttered only by dying men. What emerged in its place was something messier, but strangely alive. Local dialects, peasant tongues, fractured phrases that formed bridges where empires had failed. These new languages weren't taught in schools. They grew from mouths like weeds between cobblestones. And in them, the world began to retell itself. Less precise, perhaps, but more intimate. These languages spoke of frostbite, of misplaced bread, of children who wouldn't wake, and of saints who might still care. And they spoke, above all, of waiting, because waiting had become an art form. People waited for the next harvest, the next storm, the next news from across the hills. They waited for signs that the sky was healing, or that the ash had finally settled. And in this waiting, a strange kind of strength was born. It wasn't the strength of warriors or kings. It was quieter, more granular. The strength to not scream when your child asks why the sun looks sick. The strength to plant seeds, knowing they will likely fail. The strength to sing anyway. Over in what we now call the Middle East, the Byzantine Empire clung to its golden illusion of control. Constantinople, once a jewel of logic and law, had turned into something darker. The plague had ravaged its population. Entire streets were abandoned, their fountains dry, their mosaics cracking beneath dust. The emperor, once surrounded by senators and scholars, now governed from behind walls lined with incense and fear. Even the most powerful men in the world had begun to understand how fragile their grip was, and in the silence left by all that sickness, new whispers began to form, whispers of different gods, different rules, different futures. Some of these whispers would one day shape whole religions. But for now, they were just that. Sounds in the dark, searching for shape. Along the old Silk roads, trade had thinned, but not vanished. Caravans still creaked along dried riverbeds, now carrying fewer silks and more salt, fewer luxuries and more rumors. The goods had changed, but the instinct to connect, to reach beyond one's famine-scoured village, remained. Human beings, even in their lowest hour, refused to become islands. They needed to know that someone else was still alive, still struggling, still lighting fires in the dark. It's hard to imagine now just how long the dark lasted. Not days, not months, not even a single bad year, but a string of years, each, one dragging behind it the wreckage of the one before. This wasn't a storm, it was a season, an age, and, unlike storms, which pass, ages don't ask your permission to linger. But what's remarkable isn't just that people lived through it, it's how they did. With no grand leaders, no miracle technologies, and no guiding maps, they adapted. They buried the dead in shallower graves, because digging was hard in frozen ground. They mixed tree bark into bread dough to stretch the last handfuls of flour. They measured time not in calendars, but in how many winters a cloak had lasted. And slowly and perceptibly life began to reassemble itself, not because the crisis ended, but because people grew around it. The world was never going to return to what it had been. Rome would not be rebuilt. The old gods would not regain their thrones. But something new was forming. Not better, perhaps. Not yet, but real. Solid. Human. You can think of it like this. After a fire burns down a forest, it leaves behind a kind of silence. And in that silence, the first green shoot is not always a tree. Sometimes, it's a weed. Sometimes it's a mushroom. Sometimes, it's just a crack in the charred bark where a bird makes a nest. But whatever it is, it's life. And in the long night after 536, that's what humanity became. A crack in the bark, a stubborn weed, a small warmth in the endless gray. And though they could not see it, those frostbitten farmers and ash-covered priests, those starving children and wandering traders, they were laying the first stones of a future that would one day call them forgotten. But we won't forget. Not tonight. Not while the story still flickers in the hearth. Not while your eyes remain open, and your breath still curls gently into the quiet air. Let's keep going. The dark hasn't ended yet, but neither have we. So now you're lying there, maybe barely awake, listening to the flicker of a forgotten age, the soot-stained, ash-choked days of a world that forgot what it felt like to be warm. And just when you thought it couldn't get darker, the timeline unfolds another chapter. It's no longer just the cold, the failed crops, or the ghostly sun suspended like a dull coin in the sky. No, now something else is moving through the haze. Not fire, not storm, but something with breath. Something invisible that takes the strongest among you and brings them to their knees. This chapter begins in the eastern ports of the Mediterranean, in cities like Pelusium, where ships arrive with creaking hulls, full of grain and something else. Something clinging to fur, to straw, to the tiny, unnoticed edges of life. Rats, yes, but it's not the rats themselves. It's their passengers, their invisible hitchhikers. And here enters the next villain, in this endless year, though truthfully, it didn't need a name, it had many. But we now call it the Plague of Justinian. Imagine it with me. You live in Constantinople, one of the last flickers of Roman grandeur, where domes still shine with gold and priests chant in candlelight. The emperor, Justinian himself, is the sort of man who believes that divine order can still be restored with law books and mosaics. He's rebuilding the world one edict at a time, trying to stitch together what the centuries have unraveled. But no law touches what's coming. It begins like a whisper in the dockyards. A sailor collapses, then a beggar, then a merchant. The symptoms are sudden and cruel. Fever, swelling, delirium. People fall in the streets, and no one dares touch them. The markets go silent. The bathhouses close. Breadlines vanish. And all across the empire, from Alexandria to Antioch, a chill rolls in, not the kind that frost brings, but the kind that turns human eyes glassy and homes into tombs. By the summer of 541 AD, the disease is everywhere. And by everywhere, I don't mean metaphorically. It spreads like wildfire in a land that hasn't seen true sunlight in years. From Africa to Anatolia, from Italy to Gaul, the Black Death of the 6th century rides in silence. In some towns, it wipes out half the population. In others, there are no survivors to count. It's hard to imagine those numbers now, but try. Picture every second door in your city swinging open into a house filled with silence. Picture entire monasteries where no monks remain to ring the bells. Picture the emperor himself, just with fever in his palace, the incense choking his breath as his court prepares for succession. He survives, just barely. But the empire, it does not recover so easily. The infrastructure of survival roads, farms, granaries, justice collapses. Not all at once, but in waves. Bureaucrats die, farmers die, priests die, and with them go the delicate systems that made recovery possible. It wasn't just bodies being buried. It was knowledge, memory, continuity. You can almost hear the hum of civilization winding down, like a harpstring pulled too tight, snapping under the pressure of silence. And yet, amidst the rot, something else stirs. Not defiance, not courage. Something quieter, endurance. Let's shift the scene now, away from palaces and into the low fields of Gaul. Picture a peasant woman who has survived the famine, the frost, the shadowed sky, and now, somehow, the plague. Her hands are cracked, her children are gone, her roof leaks, but each morning she kneels in the dirt and plants something. A seed, a prayer, both maybe. She's not hoping for miracles. She's just obeying the rhythm that kept her mother alive, and her mother before her. This is how civilizations continue, not through the roar of armies, or the pronouncements of kings, but through repetition. Through humble rituals performed by people whose names history forgot, but whose persistence it depends on. In the monasteries, the scribes continue. Not all of them. Many are gone, but a few remain, scratching ink onto brittle parchment. Copying not just scripture, but fragments of knowledge, medicine, astronomy, law. Their hands shake. The light is dim. But the act of copying becomes a form of resistance, a vow to the future. We were here, their quills seemed to say. We remembered. And now, move eastward. Across the scorched remnants of Persia, across the wind-swept dunes of Arabia, life continues in scattered patterns. Oases become kingdoms. Caravanserais become cities. People stop calling themselves subjects of empires and start calling themselves tribes again, or believers, or wanderers, or whatever name gives shape to their survival. The old maps are useless. The old borders are dust. But the instinct to draw lines, to build walls, to form meaning remains. You might think by now the worst is over, that the darkness has reached its peak and must begin to lift. But that's not how decline works. It doesn't announce its climax with trumpets. It just fades, slowly, miserably. A candle sinking into its own wax. The year 542 came and went. Then 543, and on it rolled. There were moments of relief, brief thaws, harvests that didn't entirely fail, skies that briefly turned blue. And those small mercies were enough. Not for joy, but for momentum. And that's what the world needed most. Imagine now, a boy born in this era. He's never seen a normal summer. Never eaten fresh fruit. His lullabies are not about love or laughter, but about survival. His earliest memory is of carrying water to a neighbor who died the next day. And yet, he grows. He learns to work, to fear, to pray, to laugh, even in brief gusts of absurdity. Because even in catastrophe, humans find absurdity. That's our last form of rebellion. There are records, strange ones, of people dancing through the streets during plagues, laughing at the sky, holding mock funerals for themselves. Historians don't know what to make of these reports, but maybe it was a kind of ritual. Maybe it was the only way to say, we're still here. To defy the silence. To carve a little noise into a world drowning in it. And so we pause here. In the middle of the 6th century, not with a triumphant ending, but with a long breath. The kind you take when you don't know what's coming next, but you know it's not the end yet. The candle still flickers. The ink hasn't dried. And somewhere, in a cracked little hut, an old man with no teeth begins to tell his grandson a story, not a happy one, not even a clear one, but one worth repeating, because repetition is survival. And survival, in the end, is the story. Yours, mine, theirs, all of us. still walking through the long dusk after 536, still waiting for the sun to come back, still whispering, even now, into the quiet. Now then, let's drift just a little deeper. You're still there, eyes half closed perhaps, ears barely picking up the words as they meander across the long, uneven path of forgotten centuries. We're still in the long shadow of 536, and by now you've stopped expecting things to get better. That's wise of you. Because the world didn't heal like a wound with clean edges. It festered, it lingered, it adapted. And so did the people, though not in the ways you'd expect. They didn't rise from the ashes with a grand plan or a noble speech. No banners unfurled. No trumpets sang of recovery. The people who survived didn't feel victorious. Mostly they felt tired and itchy and hungry. And they looked around and realized the world they'd inherited no longer made sense. Let's visit a Villagini village. Really, somewhere in the northern stretches of what used to be the Western Roman Empire. Perhaps in Britain, or Gaul, or the misty edge of the Rhine. Wherever it is, it smells of damp moss, wet wool, and rotting bark. The thatched roofs are patched with whatever could be found. Old Roman bricks sometimes poke out beneath the soil, remnants of a world that once had roads, wine, and literacy. Now there's barter and rumor and superstition. The men carry axes, not just for trees. The women whisper charms into soup. No one trusts the sky anymore. The stars don't speak clearly. The moon seems to flicker. And when someone gets sick, they don't look for doctors, they look for omens. And yet, they endure. That same word. Again, endure. It's not glamorous, but it works. One season at a time. One muddy spring after the next. Children born, children buried, cows lost, cows born. Occasionally someone stumbles upon an old book, and no one can read it, but they keep it anyway because it feels like it matters, because it came from the time before. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the survivors of the plague go back to work, sort of. They still have the Hagia Sophia. They still have taxes. But they don't have quite enough people. The fields outside the city are patchy with weeds. The granaries echo with absence. Justinian is alive, but he's not the same. How could he be? He saw his empire crack, then melt, then rot, and still he tried to build. His builders continue erecting statues and domes. His scribes continue issuing edicts. His generals keep marching to reclaim lost provinces. But the ground beneath all of it is spongy, unstable, and no one is quite sure how much longer the weight of everything can be held up. Further east, in Persia, the Sassanid Empire is reeling too. Khusro the king has palaces and armies, but also has sickness and sandstorms and murmurs from the borderlands that the gods have gone silent. The Zoroastrian priests chant louder. The fires are kept burning day and night, not just for devotion, but for reassurance. But even fire feels different now. It smokes more. It flickers erratically. The air itself feels less obedient, less divine. The world isn't ending. No, that would be too easy. What's happening is slower, more insidious. A dragging of time, a thickening of days, a stretching of hours into something that feels like forever, twilight. And with that slow spiral, something else creeps in. Isolation. The global network of trade, pilgrimage, migration it's fraying. The Silk Road carries fewer caravans. The ports hear fewer accents. Coins are hoarded, not spent. People stay put. Not out of contentment, but out of fear. And with isolation comes forgetting. Forgetting how to build bridges. How to mend aqueducts. How to store grain for 7 years. How to write. How to speak languages that once bound provinces together. How to believe in anything beyond the next meal. In some ways, forgetting is the most dangerous thing of all. Because it doesn't arrive with a bang. It just happens, silently, like moss, growing over a name on a gravestone. Still, even forgetting has its stories. Let's go to Ireland now, cold and rain-soaked, barely touched by Rome, but full of monks who had a knack for not giving up. Here, on a cliff edge, battered by wind and seagull shrieks, scribes continue to copy old texts by candlelight. They're not entirely sure why they're doing it, except that it feels sacred, feels necessary, like breathing. The letters they copy, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, are foreign to most of them, but they copy them anyway. They illustrate them with swirling designs and animals with too many limbs. It's not just preservation, it's transformation. They are taking the old world and wrapping it in a new one. Elsewhere, in remote monasteries, early scholars begin to piece together calendars, track stars, catalog herbs. It's not quite science, not yet, but it's something, a flicker, a low ember under all that ash. And who knows, maybe that ember will catch, someday, centuries later. But for now, it's just enough to keep the cold away. Back on the mainland, the people invent explanations. Because silence is terrifying, and nature must be made to answer. Was it the wrath of God? Had the saints turned their faces away? Were the woods cursed? Did the old Roman temples, now crumbled and weed-choked, hold angry spirits? Whatever the explanation, it's soaked in fear. Fear makes rituals stronger, makes curses easier to believe, makes scapegoats necessary. So when someone coughs too loudly, or a cow dies unexpectedly, people begin to whisper, that man, that woman, that child, the plague came with them. They bring bad luck. They're not like us. It's ugly. It's ancient. It's human. Even suffering doesn't unite us the way we like to pretend. Sometimes it divides us deeper, like cracks in dry earth, waiting for fire. And yet again, somehow the story doesn't end here. It never does. The sky remains dull. The sun still refuses to shine like it used to. But crops begin, slowly, cautiously, to yield something. Not abundance, but sustenance. Enough to get by. Enough to try again. And in the distance, just barely, you can begin to hear the faint, metallic sound of something new beginning to form. Not a resurrection. Not a rebirth. But a rearrangement. The kind of reshuffling that history loves to do when no one's paying attention. Because this, dear listener, is how the Dark Ages begin. Not with a crash, but with a slow forgetting. A long pause. A smothered candle. But also a whisper. That low voice that says, we're still here. Even if the books are gone. Even if the gods are silent. Even if the sun won't rise. We are still here. And that, somehow, is enough. Now, let's lie still a little longer. There's more to tell. The darkness isn't done yet. But neither are we. Forgotten by sunlight. You're lying there, perhaps one eye closed, the other barely squinting at the inside of your eyelid. And the world we're drifting through isn't finished falling apart just yet. 536 AD may have kicked open the door to chaos, but the years that followed, oh, they politely let it in, sat it down at the head of the table, and asked it to stay for supper. And chaos, being a thoroughly impolite guest, brought friends. You see, when the sky first dimmed and the crops failed, it was a shock. Terrifying, yes, but shocking, and people, when shocked, tend to rally. For a while, but now we're in the years after. The long, soft collapse. The endless waiting for things to go back to how they were, which they never do, because time doesn't do reruns. It forgets, and it forces you to adapt, or vanish quietly, like a name scratched in wax, by 545 AD, 10 years after the worst of the volcanic veil settled over the earth. Many of those who had once tried to rebuild simply stopped trying. Entire towns, Roman, Persian, Celtic, faded not with flames or earthquakes, but with silence. No records, no ruins, just grass growing where once there were footprints. The wheel of time had turned, but instead of lifting humanity higher, it seemed to be stuck in a rut, grinding, repeating, grinding, repeating. And in this dragging spiral, something strange began to happen. People stopped believing in progress, that old Roman ideal, that the future would be better, grander, cleaner, was gone. Now, the future looked like more mud, fewer people, and an even dimmer sun. And so the minds of men turned inward, downward, backward, in Western Europe. Where once great libraries hummed with scribes and scholars, silence moved in, language fractured. Latin, once the unifying tongue of empire, splintered into the early growls of French, Spanish, Italian, not out of invention, but out of erosion. The roads fell apart, the aqueducts dried up, and the idea of a single Europe, crumbled quietly into dozens of nervous little villages, clutching their relics and their suspicions like talismans. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantinople had not forgotten its grandeur. But even marble cracks, when left too long in the cold. Justinian's rebuilding efforts continued, but the manpower was thin, the coffers lighter, and the soil beneath the city groaned under too many graves. Bureaucrats kept writing their long formal documents, declarations, tax lists, military plans, but fewer and fewer people bothered to read them. Not out of defiance. Just exhaustion. Travel, that lifeblood of empire and commerce, was no longer a given. Roads that once carried spices and news now carried wolves and ghosts. Traders were fewer, guarded, superstitious. Every town became a small planet, spinning in its own paranoid orbit. Rumors took the place of newspapers. A fever here, a pale child there, a strange star in the sky. No one trusted what came from far away anymore. Distance meant danger. Even nature began to act, oddly. The seasons misbehaved. Summers felt like late spring, or worse, like a cruel joke, with a gray punchline. Crops bloomed out of season, or not at all. Forests encroached on fields. Rivers ran strange, sometimes too full, sometimes bone dry. Farmers stopped asking what should I plant, and started asking what is least likely to kill us. This year, the tools of agriculture changed, not in sophistication, but in desperation. Smaller plots, shorter harvests, no more experiments, no more long-term thinking, just survival. But perhaps the most haunting shift was in belief. Not just religious belief, though that too, but belief in meaning, in divine order, in the idea that the world, for all its cruelty, had some logic. Because when every sunrise is dull, every winter arrives early, and every child's cough sounds like a death sentence. Faith phrase, not suddenly, slowly, like a rope soaked in water, worn down with each passing season. Some turned toward asceticism, the belief that suffering was holy. And perhaps, if you suffered enough, the world might make sense again. Monks lashed themselves. Peasants walked barefoot for miles just to touch a splinter of bone, said to belong to a saint. In Gaul, there were tales of a hermit who ate nothing but moss, and spoke only in riddles. People came to him not for wisdom, but because he looked like someone who had already died and come back confused. Others found comfort in older gods, forgotten gods, whose names still echoed in the trees and rivers. In Northern Europe, long-suppressed pagan practices resurfaced quietly. Bonfires, charms, animal bones left on doorsteps. Not because anyone thought Odin or Pan would save them, but because rituals, even empty ones, are anchors. And when the sky has no stars, and the ground gives no food, an anchor is better than nothing. And of course, some turned on each other. Fear always finds someone to blame. Foreigners, heretics, women with too much knowledge of herbs, men with strange dreams, children who didn't cry at the right times. Accusations became currency. Whispers became weapons. Justice became whatever kept the village calm for another night. Yet, and this is perhaps the most human thing of all, amidst all this slow decay, people still laughed. Not often, not freely, but they did. A poorly told joke at a funeral, a chicken that refused to die, a priest who tripped during Mass. These were not signs of resilience, exactly. They were just small reminders that the human spirit, even when buried under ash and fear, occasionally pokes its head out and says, "Well, that was weird." And in that weirdness, that quiet absurdity, something like survival stirred. Not hope, not yet. Hope requires light, but the barest hint of movement, like a seed frozen in soil, waiting for a spring that may never come, but still existing. The world of the mid-6th century wasn't in flames, it was in fog, a long gray fog that swallowed time and memory and meaning. But fog doesn't last forever, and even if the sun doesn't return in your lifetime, sometimes, someone lights a candle anyway. So stay with me. Lie. Still a little longer. The centuries ahead are not kind, but they are ours to explore. And as long as you're listening, I'll keep telling them. Now then, you've made it this far. Still breathing, still blinking. Maybe, just maybe, still awake. Or maybe you're not, and this is all drifting through the loose corners of a half-dream, painting shadows behind your eyelids. Either way, we go on. Because history doesn't care how tired you are. It keeps dragging its feet forward, clumsily, like an old soldier who's forgotten why he enlisted in the first place. And here, in the dwindling decades after the cursed year of 536, we find ourselves staring at something most peculiar. Not war, not plague, not fire, but something even slower, and somehow crueler. Forgetting, yes, forgetting, not just of facts, and names and places, though there was plenty of that, but a wider, deeper forgetting, a kind of planetary amnesia. The world itself seemed to misplace who it had once been. Cities that had once sent out ships and taxes and proclamations now sent out ... nothing. They simply sat, silent, waiting for someone to remember them. Spoiler alert, no one would. Picture a once busy port town in the old Roman West. Its docks half collapsed, its warehouses empty, its roads cluttered with weeds instead of carts. The locals, what few remained, didn't call it a city anymore. They called it the old place, because that's what it had become. Not a living, breathing community, but a husk. A memory with no one left to remember it properly. Like an attic full of boxes, labeled in a language no one speaks anymore. This was happening everywhere. Not in the dramatic way Hollywood likes to show it. No flaming castles. No mobs with pitchforks. Just slow retreat. A little less grain each harvest. A few more roofs that weren't repaired. A young man who left for the monastery and never came back. A child who asked what an aqueduct was and got only silence in return. You see? Infrastructure is one of those things you only notice when it's gone. For centuries, Rome had built things: clean water, smooth roads, public baths, forums for debate. Useful, sophisticated, boring things. But those things required maintenance, coordination, expertise. And when the sun dimmed, the fields failed, and the bodies piled up. Well, suddenly no one had time for plumbing. Take the baths, for example. Once the pride of Roman civility, communal, hygienic, political, even spiritual. Now just echoing stone rooms, filled with moss and silence. People bathed less. They blamed it on piety, on modesty, on the cold. But mostly they just forgot how the pipes worked. Soap became rare. Disease became common. The once clear line between the civilized and the unwashed blurred until no one could remember there had ever been a line at all. And into this dim, declining world crept something else. Something subtle and quiet and wrapped in parchment. Revision. Because when the present grows unbearable, the past becomes clay. Something to reshape, to rewrite, to romanticize. This is when myths began to flourish. Not the grand, thunderclap myths of Olympus or Valhalla, but softer ones. The kind whispered by candlelight in a drafty room. The kind where history loses its shape and becomes story. The Romans. Oh, they weren't practical administrators anymore. Now they were golden legends, flawless giants who had ruled a paradise. The emperors of old became demigods. The roads they built were said to have sung beneath your feet, and their fall. That wasn't due to famine or plague or internal decay. No, it was because they sinned. Because they lost favor with heaven. Because they let the wrong people in. Convenient. And as history became myth, so did morality. The collapsing world wasn't just unfortunate. It was punishment. That's how many began to see it. The bad harvest. Your village's fault. The plague. God's displeasure. The cold sun. A reflection of your cold hearts. It was easier to believe the universe was angry than to accept it was indifferent. And so flagellants walked the roads, whipping their own backs bloody in hope of divine forgiveness. Starving peasants gave their last crumb to a wandering monk, in exchange for a prayer. And children learned to fear not just wolves and raiders, but their own impure thoughts. Meanwhile, in the monasteries, those stubborn little islands of literacy and ink, monks copied texts. Slowly, carefully. Sometimes they preserved the classics. Sometimes they scribbled angry little notes in the margins. Sometimes they got bored and doodled. And sometimes ... they edited. Just a little. Changed a date. mistranslated a word, added a miracle here or there. Not out of malice, but because they genuinely believed the world needed more meaning. And if the old stories didn't provide it, well, someone had to. It wasn't all darkness. Of course, even the slowest decline leaves cracks where sunlight gets in. A few thinkers still thought. A few farmers had good years. A few families told bedtime stories that would eventually, somehow, turn into Shakespeare. But they were the exceptions. And history, that slow, unfeeling ledger of who mattered and who didn't, tends to skip exceptions. By the mid-6th century, what little remained of global trade was flickering out. Silk no longer made it from China to Rome. Papyrus grew scarce. Coins were hoarded, not spent. Barter returned. A man might trade a pig for a plow, or a daughter for peace. Not because he was cruel, but because cruelty had become a kind of logic, a way to make sense of scarcity. And all the while, the skies remained a little off. Not black, not stormy, just wrong. A gray that never lifted. A sun that felt tired. Like it too, had grown weary of shining for people who kept setting fire to everything they touched. But there's a strange comfort in shared hardship. When everyone is miserable, no one feels singled out. Communities huddled together not just for warmth, but for understanding. They knew, deep down, that they were living through something. They might not have called it a collapse. People never do, but they felt its weight. And they carried it, awkwardly, like an heirloom passed down from a forgetful grandfather. Cracked, dusty, but undeniably theirs. So here we are. Somewhere in the fog between memory and myth, truth and tale. A world that once knew the names of stars, now squints just to find the moon. A people who built empires now content to build fences. And yet, impossibly, stubbornly, life continues. Not triumphantly, not heroically, just ... continues. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most historical thing of all. Stay close. There's more to come. Let's take another quiet breath here. You've earned it. The world we've been wandering through, this strange ash-covered half-century, is not in a hurry. It never was. Time crawled in the 6th century, like an old man with frostbitten toes, limping from one bad year to the next, unsure whether he was going anywhere at all. And yet somehow, each day still insisted on arriving. And every evening came with just enough darkness to remind people they were still stuck in it. No. Empire came to the rescue. No hero galloped out of the fog. But something else did begin to creep in. A different kind of movement. Not grand, not glorious, but undeniable. A slow, stubborn flicker of reorganization. You see, when the roof caves in and the big systems fall apart, people start turning inward. Families, villages, little monasteries, tucked into hillsides, where goats outnumbered books. That's what happened now. Civilization didn't disappear. It just collapsed into itself. It folded like wet paper, forming dense little pockets of survival. Think of it like embers after a fire, glowing barely alive, scattered far and wide. Most of them went dark. But a few, just a few, refused to go out. And in these places, something strange happened. People stopped trying to get back to normal. They stopped hoping the old empire would rise again, or that the sun would return to its golden ways. Instead, they started building something smaller, something slower. Not because they wanted to, but because that was all they could do. The world had downsized, and now so had ambition. In the far corners of Europe, the Byzantine Empire still insisted it was the Roman Empire. It still printed coins with Latin slogans, still sent envoys in elaborate robes, still claimed to govern the West, even as the West barely remembered its own name. Justinian, the emperor who had once dreamed of reconquering the old territories, now found himself fighting ghosts. Ghosts of the plague. Ghosts of empty cities. Ghosts of a destiny that kept dissolving beneath his feet. Elsewhere, in places like Gaul and Germania and Britannia, leaders stopped pretending to be Roman. They adopted simpler titles. Chieftain, warlord, abbot. Their realms weren't empires. They were family fiefdoms, held together by favors and blood. Their law was a mix of memory, guesswork, and whatever the local bishop had copied down last winter. Ah, yes, the church. We should talk about them while Everything else was unraveling. The church was quietly knitting. Its fingers were cold and slow, but precise. The monks and priests didn't have armies or harvests or gold, but they had something else. Stories. Stories that promised meaning. Stories that promised heaven and hell, and rules to bridge the gap between the two. And in a world where kings forgot how to mint coins and farmers forgot how to rotate crops, these stories started to feel reliable, stable, a kind of spiritual scaffolding in a crumbling house. So the church spread, not like wildfire, but like ivy, climbing the ruins, curling around abandoned villas, pushing through the cracks. Wherever fear was thickest, faith found a foothold. The priest didn't need to bring answers. He only needed to bring words. The rest followed naturally. And in monasteries, often little more than stone barns with libraries, something fragile was preserved. The act of writing, the craft of copying. You've probably seen those beautiful illuminated manuscripts, with gold leaf and painted saints and curled letters like vines. What you don't see is the freezing monk who spent 2 winters hunched over the same page, dipping a homemade quill into half-frozen ink, just to copy the sentence correctly. Sometimes it was scripture. Sometimes it was Aristotle. Sometimes it was the weather. Today it snowed. Again, they weren't trying to save civilization. They were just trying to keep their minds occupied. But in doing so, they preserved a thread, a tiny, fraying thread, between what was and what might one day be again. We often forget that history isn't made by heroes charging into battle. Sometimes it's made by a tired man copying Latin, in the candlelight, while rats eat the cheese he'd been saving. Elsewhere, trade began to twitch back to life, in crude skeletal ways. A few coastal towns started exchanging salt for fish, cloth for grain, tin for promises. The Silk Road, that great artery of ancient commerce, was more scar tissue than blood vessel now, but it hadn't vanished entirely. Caravan routes still trudged across the Middle East and Asia, bumping into new obstacles. Warlords, tolls, sandstorms, rumors. But goods still moved, however slowly, and with them moved ideas. Broken, partial ideas, but enough to light a few new fires. The people of this era, the survivors, really didn't think of themselves as living in the Dark Ages. They just thought they were alive. And that was saying something. For them, survival became a kind of art. You didn't need to dream, or plan, or invent. You just needed to last. To make it through another winter. To find a way to patch the roof with animal skins and barter for a little grain and maybe, if you were lucky, sing a song that hadn't been sung in a while. Not because it mattered, but because it reminded you that you still had a voice. In this climate, even memory became a luxury. The old myths got blurrier. Some believed Rome had never really fallen, that it had just gone to sleep, or disappeared, behind a veil. Others said it had been punished for its sins, and they were now living in the age of reckoning. A few, quietly, began to whisper about prophecy, that something new would one day rise from the ash. But no one could agree on what, or when, or why. The sky didn't help. It remained pale and suspicious. The sun rose, but with none of its former authority. It was more of a suggestion now, a faint gold smear, like the memory of warmth. Some mornings it didn't rise at all, not really. Just slid behind clouds like a debtor, avoiding eye contact. But in the slow thaw of the 550s and 560s, as crops began to flirt with success, and trees grew back their leaves a little earlier each spring, a kind of cautious optimism took root. People didn't celebrate. They weren't foolish, but they did stop expecting disaster. They began to plan for next year, instead of merely surviving this one, and that, more than anything, marked a turning point. Because when people plan for next year, they build, they teach, they risk. Not in the way we think of modern growth, with skyscrapers and smartphones, but in the old way. A rebuilt bridge, a repaired mill, a school that taught not just scripture, but numbers. A father who decided not to sell his daughter. After all, it wasn't progress in the grand triumphal sense. It was a different kind of victory. Quiet, local, temporary, but real. So here, in the middle of the 6th century's long gray tale, something begins to change. Not because the world got better, but because people got used to how bad it was. And in that acceptance, they found space. Space to remember, to rebuild, to reimagine. And if you listen closely, past the silence, past the dust, past the endless winter, you might just hear the faintest echo of a future. Still with me. Good. There's more dust to walk through yet. Now, take a moment. Lean back in your creaky wooden chair, or burrow deeper into the blankets. We're past the worst of it, at least for now. But don't let that trick you into thinking the nightmare was over. The skies may have grown a little less grim, the ashfall may have slowed to a whisper, and the harvest stanative and pale may have started to nudge upward. But the world had changed. And when a world changes, it doesn't bounce back. It reshapes itself around the damage. It adapts, like an old dog learning to walk with a limp. And in the 560s, that limp was everywhere, political, spiritual, environmental. The earth was no longer the same, and neither were the people clinging to it by now. The survivors of the early catastrophe had aged into a strange generation. These were people who'd been children when the sun first disappeared, who'd learned to measure time not by years, but by winters. Their stories were strange to the ears of those born later. I remember the day the snow came in summer. One old man might whisper, as if recounting a fable. The animals were confused. The birds disappeared. The cows dropped dead, like sacks of leather, and those listening wide-eyed, skeptical would try to picture it, failing to imagine a world without sunlight, or a spring without flowers. These elders were now the keepers of a dark memory, a kind of living trauma that hovered over every decision. They didn't speak of golden ages. They didn't dream of Roman roads or Alexandrian libraries. They dreamed of enough grain to last the month, of children making it to adulthood with all their teeth. It was a pragmatic hope, the kind that plants shallow roots but in soil still scarred by volcanic poison. Even shallow roots were a victory, but something unexpected had also taken root during those long, gray decades. Not just survival, but identity. The old empires, with their bureaucracies and their marble statues and their long-distance politics, had collapsed like soggy bread. But in their place, new shapes had begun to resoak. Local, often clumsy shapes. Tribes reorganized. Languages fractured and diverged. Dialects once dismissed as rural slang began evolving into entire languages. Latin, once the lingua franca of a continent, began to splinter into regional offshoots, Proto-Spanish, Proto-Spanish, Proto-Italian, each one a linguistic orphan, stumbling forward in the dark, creating new rules from broken patterns. And with this fragmentation came culture, not grand golden culture, but small, meaningful culture, songs tailored to valleys, stories carved into bark, superstitions wrapped around the shape of the mountains. People no longer saw themselves as Romans or Persians or Ethiopians. They were from this village, this riverbank, this slope where the goats always went missing. Identity, like survival, had shrunk to fit the contours of the catastrophe. Meanwhile, the cities, those grand rotting carcasses of the old world, continued to either decay or mutate. Constantinople, that great Byzantine jewel, still stood, though it too had changed. The plague had gutted it. The economy had shriveled, but it was still there, flickering in the smoke, a strange blend of Christian zeal, Roman nostalgia, and Eastern influence. The Hagia Sophia stood not as a monument to glory, but as a kind of desperate prayer carved in stone. "We are still here," it seemed to whisper. "We remember what we once were." Elsewhere, cities fared worse. Alexandria, a city that had once crackled with ideas and scrolls and mathematical genius, was now a shell. Rome, the eternal city, was more of a museum of ruins than a functioning capital. London had retreated into myth. Most urban centers became either fortified monastic settlements or haunted graveyards echoing with the footsteps of stray dogs. Still, even in ruin, cities exerted a strange gravity. People would wander back to them like ghosts returning to childhood. Homes, they'd pick through rubble, dig in old cisterns, build crude shelters between shattered columns. The stones of ancient empires were looted and reused, sometimes out of reverence, often out of necessity. A fallen aqueduct might become a wall. A temple might become a barn. A coliseum might house pigs. Recycling, after all, is the oldest form of respect. Trade, too, crept forward like a wounded animal. It was no longer the elegant silken gold exchange it once had been. Now it was barter, grudging and small. A sack of salt for 3 knives. A jar of honey for wool. But these exchanges mattered. Each transaction was a tiny pact and agreement that life, however reduced, would go on. And where there is trade, there is information. Not always accurate, rarely timely, but information nonetheless. Through these fractured networks came rumors of distant kings, of new faiths, of lands untouched by the ash and the plague. Most of these were lies, half-formed fantasies born in taverns and camel trails. But some weren't. Word began to spread, for example, of a prophet in Arabia. Quiet. Rumors at first. Whispers, nothing more. A man who spoke with fire in his voice. A man whose words moved people the way rivers move stone. But that's a story still brewing on the horizon. In the meantime, spiritual life in the mid-6th century was a strange mosaic. Christianity had become both universal and fragmented. In Rome, the Pope continued to send letters, but few read them. In Gaul, bishops doubled as governors. In Ireland, Christianity had taken on a uniquely wild and poetic formful of isolation and ink. Of saints who talked to animals and monks who built churches out of driftwood. Meanwhile, older gods lingered in the woods. Paganism hadn't vanished, had just changed wardrobes. The line between saint and spirit was thin. Villagers might pray to Saint Bridget and leave an offering at the old well in her name. But in their hearts, they weren't sure if she was a Christian nun or a river goddess, perhaps both. Theology was flexible. What mattered was that it worked, that the crops grew, that the cough went away, that the dreams didn't come back. Even the calendar had become slippery. With records lost and memory unreliable, time itself became more subjective. For some, it was still the year 565. For others, who hadn't seen a Roman official in decades, it might as well have been year 1 again. Monks tried to keep track, scratching dates into wood and vellum. But for most people, time was personal. It began with the day the old cow died. The day the first son was born. The year the sun looked like sackload, and through it all, humanity persisted not heroically, not triumphantly, but stubbornly. A girl learned to read from her uncle's one surviving manuscript. A boy discovered how to trap rabbits without freezing his fingers off. A village learned how to rotate crops, not because of science, but because the soil forced them to. This wasn't progress by design. It was progress by exhaustion, by failure, by accident. But it was progress nonetheless. So if you're still with me, if your eyes haven't closed just yet, if you're still tracing the shape of this wounded world with me, then know this: the darkness didn't win. It tried. It had every advantage: volcanoes, disease, famine, despair. But still, people lit candles. Still, someone taught a child to sing. Still, a monk copied a book he couldn't read. And somewhere, in some forgotten corner of a forgotten town, someone looked up and saw the sky begin just barely to turn blue again. And that was enough to keep going. Now, stay still. Breathe slow. The light is coming. But not yet. Not quite yet. We have more dust to walk through. Now imagine this. It's a cold morning somewhere in the early 570s. You're waking up on a straw bed that smells faintly of mildew, the roof above you patched with animal hides and prayer. There's smoke curling lazily from the cooking fire. Not because anyone's making breakfast yet, but because it never really stopped burning through the night. Someone has to keep the embers alive. You step outside and you pause. The air tastes like wet ash. The grass is trying to grow again, in patches, hesitantly. There are no birds singing, only the slow cough of a neighbor and the rustle of goats rooting through the mud. This is not a world of heroes. It's not a place of epics. This is the world that comes after the slow, quiet middle of history, where everything still hurts but no one has the strength to scream about it. The trauma of the 530s and 540s hadn't just gone away, you see. It had sunk deep into the bones of the people. This wasn't the kind of pain you write about in a letter. It was the kind you inherit, like the shape of your jaw or the slope of your shoulders. Entire generations were now born under dim skies, raised by survivors who didn't talk much, who counted blessings in terms of surviving winter. If you asked an old woman about the year without sun, she might shake her head slowly and say something vague like, "That was the year the chickens stopped laying." And then she'd go back to her stitching, as if that one detail was enough to describe the apocalypse. And in a strange way, maybe it was. But this murky stretch of history wasn't completely stagnant. It was alive in its own grim, stunted way. Cultures were shifting like tectonic plates underfoot, slowly, silently, dangerously. The old order of Europe, the crumbling leftovers of the Western Roman Empire, had become a playground of scavengers and improvisers. The Franks in Gaul were no longer pretending to be Romans. They had their own kings now, barbarian warlords with Christian names and pagan tempers. The Visigoths were sketching borders in Spain. The Ostrogoths were arguing theology in Italy, though half their monasteries had collapsed and most of their bishops were sick. And the Anglo-Saxons, up in the misty reaches of post-Roman Britain, they were planting villages like mushrooms in a forest, small, damp, and multiplying. Their stories weren't about Caesar or Augustine. They were about wolves, about dragons, about swords pulled from lakes. Myth was rising like steam from the cracks of the broken world. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, what remained of Roman dignity, was still lurching forward under Emperor Justin II, who had inherited a throne coated in soot and splinters. His predecessor, Justinian, had done what he could, built churches, passed laws, tried to stitch together the East and West with thread made of plague and ambition. But Justinian had died, old and disappointed, and now his successor was left, balancing a bowl full of broken eggs. Wars flared up again. The Persians were back, as they always were, with their endless cavalry and eternal grievances. The Slavs were poking down from the north. The Avars, a nomadic confederation of horse raiders, had started testing the edges of Europe like wolves testing a fence. These were not full-scale invasions, not yet, but they were signs, omens, the kind of subtle shifts that only make sense in hindsight, when you're already too far downstream to paddle back. And far, far to the south, something strange was stirring, in the deserts of Arabia. But let's not skip ahead, because even as the earth slowly began to warm, and the ash began to settle into the soil, the human mind remained troubled. This wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was a spiritual one. Imagine trying to believe in divine order when the sun itself refuses to shine. Imagine kneeling in prayer while your neighbors die coughing black blood. Entire theologies buckled under the weight of that silence. Churches and temples didn't collapse from fire. They collapsed from the pressure of too many unanswered questions. Some people turned inward. They built monasteries on windswept cliffs and sat in silence for days, waiting for answers that never came. Others turned outward, preaching, warning, accusing. Heresy became a political tool. If crops failed, it wasn't the weather, it was the Jews, or the pagans, or the people who crossed themselves the wrong way. Accusation became liturgy. Scapegoats became ritual. But not everyone was cruel or mad. Some found gentler ways to cope. They sang, even if their voices cracked. They told stories, even if they had to make them up. In Ireland, monks copied Latin texts by candlelight, not because they were ordered to, but because something inside them believed the world might need them again. They painted the margins with curling vines and golden beasts, as if to remind the future that beauty had not died completely. Elsewhere, Islamic calendars had not yet begun. The Prophet Muhammad had not yet received revelation. But the stage was being set. Trade routes in Arabia were bustling, and Mecca had become a strange blend of commercial hub and spiritual battleground. The Kaaba stood surrounded by idols. The region was ripe with ideas, tensions, and quiet expectation. The ash cloud had missed the Arabian Peninsula directly, but the aftershocks had rippled through everything. The entire world was still reeling, like a boxer stumbling back to his corner. Dizzy, but not quite down. This is where we begin to see something subtle and unsettling. The fragility of civilizations. Yes, but also, their stubbornness. Humans do not rebuild exactly what they had. They reinterpret it. They guess at it. They improvise, often badly. But in doing so, they create something new. The world of the late 6th century was not a restoration of the Roman Golden Age. It was a twisted, haunted echo of it, one where amphitheaters held sheep, where aqueducts crumbled into the hills, where emperors gave orders that only reached as far as the next village. And yet, life, always life, crooked and cracked, but still growing. A blacksmith somewhere in northern Italy was figuring out a better kind of horseshoe. A girl in Alexandria was teaching herself to read from a page torn out of a scroll. A midwife in Gaul was passing on herbal knowledge that would one day find its way into a medical manuscript. This wasn't a rebirth. It was a murmur, a pulse, and perhaps, in some deep subconscious way, people began to believe again. Not in certainty, not in safety, but in possibility. That the skies might clear, that the fields might yield, that the children might live. It wasn't optimism. It was something more primal, something quieter. Hope, not as a philosophy, but as a habit. So you keep walking. You tie your boots with twine. You fix the roof again. You teach your son how to gut a fish. You give your daughter a name from a language you barely understand, and you wait, not for miracles, just for spring, because spring always comes. Eventually, now rest your eyes. If they haven't already grown heavy, the worst has passed, but the story isn't finished. Not by a long shot. There are still empires to fall, revelations to be heard, and entire calendars yet to begin.